Welcome to the New Mexico Military Museum podcast, where we uncover the powerful stories of history and the remarkable individuals who bring them to life. I'm your host, Ryan Swartzen, and today I'm honored to be joined by Wayne Wright, author of Bataan Corridor. This deeply personal and meticulously researched account chronicles his father's extraordinary journey as a teenage soldier in World War II, fighting in the Philippines and during the Battle of Bataan, and surviving the brutal hardships of years spent in POW camps. Wayne, thank you for being here. Before we dive into the book, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. Could you share a bit about your background, what inspired you to tell your father's story, and when did you realize this was something that needed to be shared in a book?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Ryan. My background is, unlike my father, I was a little older when I joined the Navy as a young man. I was 18. The United States Navy trained me as a Russian linguist, which led me on a career in what we could call the intelligence business. I spent 4 years in the Navy on deployments using my language, Russian language training. After my enlistment was over, I returned to school, got my bachelor's in Russian, University of Maryland. Later, got my master's in national security studies at Georgetown University, and continued to work after I was out of uniform in um, the intelligence community, first with the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, Maryland, later with the Office of Naval Intelligence, both in the Pentagon and their campus in the Maryland suburbs. After I then shifted to working in private industry, but still supporting intelligence community entities as a private contractor, and I did that for another 25 years. So about 35 years involved in intelligence community and in the main working with in military problems and with military folks. The Going to the topic of writing the book. My father wasn't very open about his experiences in World War II, and when we were children, I have three siblings. I took him a number of years before he was ready to speak about what he had gone through and the sacrifices that were made in the Philippines and after as prisoners of the Japanese. And when we were kids, he would tell funny stories or interesting stories, but nothing that would have hinted at what he had gone through. I didn't find out until much, much later that he had been on not just one, but two different hell ships as a prisoner of the Japanese. Um, it took a while before my father, I think I mentioned it was, but before my father was ready to speak about his experience, it took almost 40 years after the end of World War II before he started to open up. I think it was his attendance at a POW reunion in North Carolina in the mid 1980s that got him thinking about capturing his experience and sharing it with other people. So he, in the mid 80s, he created a presentation that he, in his own words, would give to anybody that would listen about his experiences. Sometime after that, I finally sat down with him thinking that I would write a book about his experience. And I had long talks with him, interviews, if you will, about his experience, followed up with emails, more talks, phone calls, just trying to understand exactly what he had gone through. Um, my timeline to get that done, actually, this was back in 2005. I thought I would knock out a book in a couple of years, and that turned out not to be the case. So family and work got in the way. 5 years later, my father passed away, and the project got shelved. I picked it up again about 4 years ago and finished it off last year and published that book, Bataan or Bataan. I've come to learn to pronounce it properly. Bataan, Corregidor, prisoner of war. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's teaching an old dog new tricks. I grew up saying Bataan. My father said Bataan. I'm doing my best to be that old dog that can learn a new trick and say Bataan.
No, absolutely. We've got about three buildings down here that are named after the Bataan Death March and various other aspects of that whole tragedy. So I have been corrected many times and in many different ways myself, so I completely understand. Okay, yeah, so that gives us a pretty good overview of what got you started on this trail. So, kind of jumping into your father's history, I believe in your book you talk about how he enlisted at 15. What was that process like? What compelled him to enlist at such a young age?
Yeah, I think it goes back to his father died when he was 10 years old in the mid 1930s. He died of tuberculosis. My father was from Albuquerque. Father died. He had been a pressman with the Albuquerque Journal. Um, Several years later, his mother remarried. Fast forward a bit to the late summer of 1941, and I think a combination of factors. Just he was ready for something else, even though he was 15. And I believe that his relationship with his stepfather was not the greatest. So he was ready for a new challenge. He actually went. He thought he could pass for someone older. He was a pretty big kid. He was 5'10", maybe 170 pounds. So he went to the Navy recruiters first and asked them, hey, I'd like the adventure of joining the United States Navy. And they said they'd love to have him if he could just bring his birth certificate with him when he visited next. They would get him into the Navy. So he went back to his next step was to go to the United States Army recruiters, and they pretty much said, sign here. They were, yeah, they were not only willing to believe the lie he was telling about his age, they gave him some choices. They said he could go to the Panama Canal Zone or Hawaii or the Philippines. And in his young wisdom, he chose the place farthest away from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he would be assigned to the 31st Infantry Regiment in the Philippine Division based in Manila, the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Um, of course, the problem was he wasn't a great student of current affairs at the time, and he didn't realize he was stepping into extreme tension between the United States and the Empire of Japan. Just 2 months earlier, based on the move of the Japanese into French Indochina, today's Vietnam, General MacArthur was recalled to active duty in the Philippines to take on a new command, U.S. Army Forces Far East. And reinforcements were flowing to the Philippines from the West Coast and Hawaii. And turns out my father was one of those reinforcements, as well as you know, the National Guard units from places like New Mexico, some tank battalions, promises of many aircraft to come to MacArthur's command. So that's how his joining the army unfolded, and him ending up over there pretty much on the eve of war. He arrived in the Philippines in late October 1941. He went through 6 weeks of basic training with his regiment and then joined them on November 27th, 1941, you know, literally 10 days before the war would break out.
Yeah, so kind of getting thrown into the fire on that one. Yeah, no, that's an incredibly interesting start to a service, to be sure. Yeah, what was his experience during the battle? What were some of the moments that stood out the most to you during the process of researching this, talking to him about his experience, and just overall, what were some of the most key details, do you think?
Yeah, his so he was with the 31st Infantry Regiment in the 2nd Battalion in F Company. The 31st was part of the Philippine Division. The Philippine Division was really the only U.S. Army infantry division in the Philippines at the time. MacArthur was going to have to rely on the Philippine Army and primarily Philippine Army reserves that were being mobilized in anticipation of a problem with the Japanese. When So in the Philippine division, there were three infantry regiments, the 31st, and then two Philippine scout regiments, the 45th Regiment and the 57th. Philippine scouts were enlisted Filipinos led in the main by American officers. But they were well trained, highly respected in the Army, and as the start of the war, they may have been better prepared for the war than the 31st Infantry was. The 31st, although the division and those infantry elements were going to receive significant reinforcements at the start of the war, the 31st Infantry, instead of being at a wartime strength of about 3,300 men, was at about 1,750 men. On top of that, the many of the senior officers and senior non-commissioned officers from the 31st had been stripped out of the unit to train the Philippine reserves that were being mobilized. So on the eve of war, they were undermanned and had, significantly less experienced leadership leading the way. The two regiments of Philippine Scouts were slightly better off. They were about 2,200, 2,250 men each. But as I said, the infantry reinforcements were flowing, but not that fast. And at the start of the war were those strengths that I just mentioned for the Philippine division. Just one other thing worth mentioning: those reinforcements that MacArthur was receiving, he wasn't scheduled to receive all of his reinforcements until April 1942. Problem there was the Japanese weren't willing to wait for that. When the war started, his regiment was they pretty much ran all over Luzon, near Manila, and then down in the Bataan Peninsula. First, they were sent over to on the first day of the war, December 8th, west of the international date line. They were sent over to Nichols Field nearby Manila to guard against a potential paratroop assault, which didn't happen. They then were sent into the Bataan Peninsula to prepare defensive positions. During those first few weeks, the Japanese had pretty much gained control of the air and the seas around the Philippines, and the Philippine American force was waiting for the main Japanese invasion to come in amphibious landings that they expected to come north in Lingayen Gulf. Again, after going into Bataan to prepare some defensive positions, there was a concern that an amphibious landing by the Japanese might come over in Subic Bay. So his regiment was sent over to what they call the zigzag road above Olongapo and Subic Bay to guard against an amphibious assault there, and that didn't happen either. So in the end, once the main Japanese invasion came on December 22nd, 1941, with the ground troops, his regiment and others were preparing to pull back into Bataan. His first taste of combat actually was on January 5th. There were General Wayne Wright, who had previously been the commander of the Philippine Division, was now commander of the North Luzon Force. He was responsible for setting up delaying positions through the central plain of Luzon to slow down the Japanese so that all of the Philippine American or Phil-American force could get into Bataan. The last delaying action, the 31st Infantry Regiment, my father's regiment, became involved in, it was a place called Layak Junction. Back to the leadership issue I mentioned, on my father's part of the line, he said, "Hey, I just kept my head low. There was artillery rounds were coming in, but there was really no effort against his part of the line. But on another element of the line, there were some leadership issues with some of the younger company commanders there, and two of them had to be replaced after that action. Once that delaying action was accomplished and all that was meant to get into Bataan was in Bataan, his regiment pulled back in as well. The Philippine Division elements, those three regiments I mentioned, the 31st and the two Philippine Scout regiments, were part of General MacArthur's strategic reserve on the peninsula. General Wayne Wright was placed in charge of the First Corps on the left of the Bataan Peninsula, General Parker on the right, and the Second Corps. And that's how things started out. And I think you know the story, Ryan, that in addition to the 80,000 troops that made it into Bataan, 15,000 Americans and 65,000 Filipinos, there were an additional 26,000 Filipinos. 6,000 of those were actually under the employ of the United States Army, but the other 20,000 were Filipino refugees that surged in behind the line before the gate to Bataan, if you will, was closed. The strategy that MacArthur had to rely on, something called War Plan Orange that had been around for decades, assumed that the garrison in the Luzon in the Philippines, the main force on the Philippines, would be overwhelmed by a Japanese invasion and they would have to pull into Bataan. That's what happened. But the plan had been the expectation there'd be 43,000 troops with stores of 6 months. And now you had far more many mouths to feed and probably not even 6 months of stores. So when they pulled into Bataan, I think it was January 5th, that General MacArthur um, cut the daily ration of the soldiers in half, and their rations would be cut again in February and in March. And as my father once said, we were being starved by our own leaders, and then suffering from disease and malnutrition that would follow later on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was a completely horrible situation that these men and soldiers and civilians were all forced to endure in the face of an unrealistic and frankly unprecedented attack from the Japanese that caught American war planners completely by surprise.
Yeah, and I guess that what I learned in reading the history, and it goes back to the plan to reinforce the Philippines, War Plan Orange, the plan to, with assuming they would be overwhelmed, that had been there for some time, but I think everybody realized. In fact, one Army officer said that War Plan Orange in the Philippines was a comforting fiction. That to assume that they could hold out for 6 months and wait for the U.S. Pacific Fleet to come and rescue them was not realistic at any time. And then obviously it was not realistic after Yamamoto's general, or excuse me, Admiral Yamamoto's strategy of attacking Pearl Harbor to either destroy or significantly damage the U.S. Pacific Fleet in the first hours of the war. That certainly pretty much predicted the outcome. I think it was Lewis Morton, who was a historian of the U.S. Army. He had said that the outcome of the defense of the Philippines had been decided at Pearl Harbor. That's the way he phrased it. So in my mind, and I think in the mind of most historians, the strategy was always in doubt. The only thing that would turn that around would be if MacArthur had received those reinforcements, he might have had a fighting chance. But in my counting of aircraft and other reinforcements coming to the Philippines, he was promised 500 aircraft of various types: B-17 long-range bombers, medium bombers, pursuit aircraft, and I think only 142 had arrived by the time the war had started. And as I mentioned before, the infantry and other ground force units were not scheduled to show up for some time. So I think maybe the question is one that can never be answered. Could they have fended off an attack by the Japanese in April of 1942 if they had been properly reinforced? And we'll never know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We can speculate as much as we want, and it often happens around here at the Bataan Museum, where myself or some of the other historians will go through and compare. Could this certain amount of supplies have made a difference? And like you said, there's no realistic way to tell the difference because that's not how history played itself out.
Right. And I think a challenge I face, I have read many first person accounts of events on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor and elsewhere in the Philippines, a lot of histories more broadly about the Pacific War. And the approach I took in the end in writing the book was here's what happened, and maybe it's back to my training in writing intelligence reports. Here are the facts. Here are some conclusions, but keep the emotion out of it. Um, just let the facts speak for themselves. You asked about my father's other activities there. He earned his Purple Heart later on at the pretty much the first main attack by the Japanese once MacArthur's garrison was pulled into Bataan. On the right side of the line, General Parker and the Second Corps The Japanese developed a breach around January 14th, I think it was. And as the reserve, the 31st Infantry and its sister regiment, Philippine Scouts, the 45th Infantry Regiment, were both pushed forward to try to stabilize that line. As his battalion was approaching the launch point for their counterattack, the Japanese attacked. He was wounded immediately. Some either a grenade or a mortar round had gone off right in front of him, blew away his helmet, his M1 Garand rifle, and in his words, there was blood everywhere. His captain, his company commander, an F Company, Captain Gene Conrad, was over him almost immediately and started tending to his wounds. He was relieved by a medic, and after a few minutes, the medic asked my father if he could walk back to an aid station. He said he could, so they beat feet out of there. And back at the aid station, they cut away his shirt. They thought he had a significant wound in his torso someplace. Once they got rid of his shirt, they realized the blood was from a head wound. He had a piece of either shrapnel from the grenade or mortar round, or maybe even a piece of his helmet lodged in his scalp. They pulled that out. He had a couple of puncture wounds from shrapnel on his shoulder and left leg. They took care of those. He had severe burns on the left side of his neck and ear from the blast. They they put something on there to help him out, and then they sent him back to the hospital number one, the field hospital number one on Bataan, farther back in the rear. He was able I guess by the way, that counterattack never succeeded. On succeeding days, the General Parker tried to get the 31st and the 45th Infantry to take back that portion of the line that the Japanese had breached. After a while, they just pulled back and dug in below where the Japanese position had been established. My father actually came back and joined his unit about 4 or 5, maybe 6 days later, um, maybe with a better appreciation for why you wear a steel helmet. And it was shortly after that, I think around January 22nd, that General MacArthur ordered the withdrawal to the reserve line on Bataan. Um, at that point, the Japanese officer in charge of the invasion, General Homa, had made an attempt against that reserve line over several days with significant losses, and finally realized that he couldn't take that amount of losses over time. That line wasn't going to break at that point, and his troops, just like the Phil-American force, was suffering from rampant malaria from being on the Bataan Peninsula. So he pulled back, and from about February 8th, there started a period that people have called the lull on Bataan, Lull. Um, and General Homa asked for reinforcements, and he would take on the Phil-American force at the date of his choosing at some point in the future.
Yeah, no, that provides a good picture of what your father went through, and especially given the fact that this was only a 4 month siege that took place, is quite the trial by fire for a young kid who, went in search of a little adventure up in the Philippines, didn't realize just how much he was gonna, get out of that one.
Yeah, he during that lull in the action, he actually switched jobs. He was made a BAR man, a Browning automatic rifleman. Uh, it was BAR team was the gunner, and an assistant gunner. His assistant gunner was actually a sergeant, outranked him significantly, even though he was a young man. And Sergeant DeStefan, Sergeant DeStefan was actually an augmentation troop to the 31st Infantry in that lull on Bataan. The 31st received about 400 reinforcements. These were men from various other non-infantry units, primarily from air-ground units that no longer had aircraft to support, so they were reassigned as infantry. Um, Also, during that lull, my father actually had a birthday. He turned 16 on Bataan on March 15th, 1942.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a very interesting way to turn 16, go sign up for the army at 15, thinking it's going to be a great great time exploring the world, seeing a different continent, and then on your 16th birthday, you're under siege by the Japanese Empire in one of the deadliest wars in history. So definitely not the way he envisioned. Yeah. So just going on from there, I believe in your book you discuss how he was eventually captured in the ultimate surrender, and then transported or endured some of his time as a prisoner onto the hell ship. So if you could just go into a little bit more on that.
Sure. The when the final assault came by General Homa's forces, it started on about April 3rd, 1942. He he had given himself a month to finally subdue that garrison, and it took him only a week. The combination of just the rampant disease and malnutrition of the troops, and not having basically being overwhelmed by a Japanese force in the end with no resupply in between. It made the outcome come pretty fast. My father was the 31st Infantry was pushed forward to mount a counterattack after the first breakthrough there about April 6th, I think it was. They were unable to launch their counterattack because the Japanese pretty much overwhelmed their line. So then you have Filipino and American soldiers scrambling through the jungle to try to get back to establish a second and a third line, which they tried to do on the right side of General Parker's line. Eventually, my father and his assistant gunner, Sergeant DeStefan, were separated from the unit, and they had made it down to a little town called Cabcaben along Manila Bay. They had heard that there was an order out to surrender the following day, and they had a quick conversation, decided they weren't ready to surrender. So they made their way to the southern tip of Bataan, found a Filipino that had a small boat who intended to get over to Corregidor offshore that night, and they joined with him, and they successfully got over there. So when they arrived on Corregidor, apparently around 1,000 folks were able to escape from Bataan before the surrender. Many of them went directly into the hospital in the Lenta Tunnel because they were in such bad shape. My father and Sergeant DeStefan were in enough of decent shape to be reassigned to the 4th Marines, who were on Corregidor and responsible for beach defense, and they became a 50 caliber machine gun team looking out over the strait between Bataan and Corregidor. After a couple of weeks, he had his first malaria attack, and a combination of that and the dysentery put him in the hospital in Malinta Tunnel. When Corregidor finally surrendered on May 6th, they quickly emptied out the hospital of anybody that didn't have some obviously debilitating wound or disease, and he was one of those kicked out. He ended up in something called the 92nd Garage area on Corregidor. They stuffed around 11,000 prisoners, Filipino and American prisoners, into that space for a couple of weeks. Apparently, they were didn't move them out of there very quickly because they were trying to keep some pressure on General Wayne Wright to make sure that he had all the forces under his command in all of the Philippines follow his surrender order. Um, from there, the Corregidor men were moved into billeted prison, taking some transports over from Corregidor, and then eventually were transported up to several camps in the area of Cabanatuan and central Luzon. And he went to Cabanatuan Camp 3 initially, and later was transferred to the main camp, Cabanatuan Camp 1. And, we've skipped over it because it's not my father's story, but on May 9th started the Bataan Death March. Um, many of my father's comrades for the 31st Infantry participated in that. Some died along the way. And I refer to the period from the surrender of Bataan to probably December that year into January 1943 is the first wave of death for the prisoners of the Japanese in the Philippines. It started with the Bataan Death March. Around 700 Americans died. Let's say as many as 700 Americans died there. Many thousands of Filipinos. And then the camp that those men, those that were surrendered on Bataan, had gone to was called Camp O'Donnell. And because the men were in such bad shape and had been starved and were continued to be starved by the Japanese in that camp, they continued to die. Um, the I think 1,500 or more Americans died in Camp O'Donnell. Many, many more Filipinos died. I think the final toll by the summer of that year was 26,000 Filipinos died at Camp O'Donnell. When the Camp O'Donnell was finally closed in early June, I think it was 1942, they moved to Camp Cabanatuan, Camp One, and they continued to die. They were continued to be starved and by the Japanese and not receive medications that might have helped them for their various ailments. It wasn't until the Japanese started an increased ration in November of 1942 and then started releasing Red Cross packages, food packages to the prisoners that things started to stabilize. Um,
I know absolutely. There, just looking over my stats here, there was at least 2,700 confirmed American POW casualties at Cabanatuan alone. So it was just truly a horrific situation.
yeah, his strategy as a prisoner in these camps was to stay busy, and he spent an awful lot of time on both the grave digging detail and the burial detail. Um, he also worked on the wood cutting detail. They needed significant amounts of wood every day to keep the cauldrons boiling in the camp kitchens, mostly cooking rice. Um, his strategy from the beginning was if he was physically able, he wanted to get out and do something other than sit in the POW camp. In January of 1943, he was tagged to go to a work camp elsewhere on Luzon. Uh, Almost immediately, even in Camp O'Donnell, the Japanese were making draws from these camps to send prisoners on work details. From Cabanatuan, they sent quite a few, and in some cases, early in their imprisonment, some folks were being shipped to other parts of the expanded Japanese Empire and back to Japan. My father was sent to a place called the Lipa Airfield. It was about 50 miles southeast of Manila. It was They were involved in extending the runway at that airfield and adding some taxiways and also adding some building revetments to protect aircraft and gun emplacements to defend the airfield. I got lucky in that in my research, I found a book written by one of the medical officers that had been at the Lipa camp. Um, and he didn't, what was great about it was he didn't write his memoir based on memory. He had recovered the notes he had kept as a prisoner of war after the war was over. And he kept detailed notes as a medical man. And so it gave me a better insight into what was going on at that camp and the one that followed later, 1944. The Lipa camp was closed, and all of the men were shifted over to a place called Camp Murphy, closer to Manila. There was an airfield next door, a Zablan field. So they again were working on airfield construction for the several months they were there. Um, at that point, we're talking about September 1944, and you know, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz were having great success in pushing in on that expanded Japanese empire. And on September 21st, I think the men at Camp Murphy, my father included, saw Navy aircraft overhead, U.S. Navy aircraft launched from aircraft carriers. They actually attacked Camp Murphy in the airfield, destroyed one of the barracks of the POWs, but no one had any significant injuries from that. And then I think very briefly, those men thought they might be rescued soon, and that turned out not to be the case. The Japanese had already started a great exodus of sorts, the forced exodus of the prisoners out of the Philippines back to Formosa in Japan, first hell ship voyage that he participated in. And if you're interested, Ryan, I can give you a few details about that.
Yeah, yeah. If you want to briefly go into what the experience was like on these hell ships, just so that our listeners have an idea of what this experience was like and how traumatic it was.
Yeah, I think to start with, the main exodus began in the summer of 1944. There were 7 different ships uh, put to sea from Manila carrying POWs. Some of them had actually come up from Singapore carrying British, Dutch, Australian prisoners. Um, they had stopped in Manila and regrouped and then headed out. So between mid-July and the end of August, 7 different ships left Manila with POWs. They all safely made it to their destinations. That wasn't the case with the next 4 that left, and my father was on one of those, and he was pretty lucky. Um, those ships were Hafuku Maru, which also had come up from Singapore earlier, Hakusen Maru, where my father was, Arisan Maru, and Aryoku Maru. Um, 3 of those 4 ships did not make it to their destination. Hafuku Maru and Arisan Maru were sunk outright. Um, Hafuku Maru was attacked by U.S. carrier-based aircraft and sunk. Only 142 POWs survived out of almost 1,300.
Yeah,
Arisan
the
Maru had about
truly
18.
horrific aspect of that was a lot of these U.S. pilots really didn't have any idea that these were POW transport ships. There was no way to officially tell the difference between a Japanese military supply ship and a cargo carrier carrying their fellow comrades in arms. So it was just a truly terrible situation to be in.
Right, and the Japanese didn't make any attempt to put any kind of special markings. They could have put a red cross, you would think, on the ship to indicate something that was non-military, but they didn't. So yeah, like you said, submariners and bombers launched from aircraft carriers just saw another target, and that's so they attacked. So Hafuku Maru went down from carrier-based aircraft. Arisan Maru had 1,800 prisoners on board. It was sunk by the USS Shark, a submarine. Only 9 men survived that, 9 POWs. Uh, the last was Oryoku Maru, had 1,620 men, and that's just a long saga I won't go into, but it was attacked off of Subic Bay, off the island of Luzon. It eventually was dead in the water off of Olongapo Point there. The surviving POWs made it to shore. They were rounded up and later on put on 2 other hell ships. They had gone on to Formosa from there. One of those ships was attacked in Formosa by aircraft. In the end, out of the 1,620 men that had boarded Oryoku Maru, only about 550 made it to Japan. Um, so my father's ship, the Hakusen Maru, I just think if you look at my father's story, he's just incredibly lucky. He said he thought somebody might have been looking out for him, but most of it seemed to be dumb luck. Um, they were their convoy left on around the 3rd of October, 1944. It was their convoy was attacked by submarines a couple days later. I believe 2 or 4 ships were sunk in that convoy, but not his ship. Um, the convoy then the remaining ships in the convoy kind of scrambled for wherever they could go and not be attacked. Some went west to Hainan Island. He on the Hakusen Maru and 2 other ships went to Hong Kong, where they thought they could get safe harbor for a while and then make the trip north to Formosa. And then what happens when they get to Hong Kong? A couple days later, the 14th Air Force decides to do a raid on Hong Kong. Um, the They arrived in force on the 16th of October. There were 34 B-24 and B-25 bombers supported by 38 P-40 and P-51 escorts. They bombed the Kowloon docks across from Hong Kong. They bombed shipping in the harbor. The after-action report from that said that 8 freighters were sunk in the harbor, 11 were damaged. My father said they had a close call on his ship, but did not get hit. Several days later, they made their way to Formosa. Um, Again, a submarine attacking their convoy along the way, and they did not get attacked. And they're the Japanese. I think their intent was to take them on to Japan, but they'd been on board so long, the Japanese ended up offloading them in Formosa, and they spent a couple of months there in camps. Part of the story of Hakusen Maru was similar to other ships that did not suffer severe damage or were not sunk by friendly forces. The conditions were so bad, the men were just dying like flies. So in the 39 days Hakusen Maru was at sea, 36 men died. And it's just the condition of the men wasn't great when they got on board. You put them in, you lock them in a coal, a hold in the ship that used to carry coal, and then you don't feed them very well and don't give them much water. Uh, you could predict the outcome for some men that were just on the brink of death in the first place.
Yeah,
They
no,
actually in it,
go ahead.
and in Formosa they were allowed to recover their health. It was probably the first time that had happened. That the camp commander was the Japanese camp commander was fairly benign in their treatment and actually saw that they got enough food to recover because so many of the men were in such bad shape. I think my father, when he arrived in Formosa, he started the war at 170 pounds. He was down to 105 pounds when he got off of Hakusen Maru. He was able to gain about 20 of that back during his stay on Formosa. In let's see, January, the it might have been February. I'm missing out on the date at this point, but they boarded their second hell ship and were on their way to Japan. Um, the that ship was a little bit better equipped to hold the prisoners, a little bit better conditions, certainly better food. Um, at Japan, just to close out his experience, Ryan, unless you have other specific questions, he initially went to Kobe, Japan, a camp called Wakanahama. It's actually a neighborhood called Wakanahama. And the men in his detail worked at a steel plant along the waterfront in Kobe. And then, of course, just following the theme, within a month or so, the Army Air Forces started doing B-29 bombing raids into mainland Japan on Honshu. Kobe was pretty much bombed out. The steel factory was destroyed, and the men were then sent to a camp in central Honshu on a lake. And for the first time, um, nobody died in that camp. I don't know if you could assume maybe that the Japanese saw the end was close and were not willing to punish these prisoners any longer. Um, and then finally, I think the Japanese formally surrendered on around September 2nd. And my father's camp at Maibara, it was called, was liberated on the 9th of September. There's a picture I have in the book of his camp. The some of the supplies dropped in once the war was over. B-29s and some Navy aircraft dropped in some supplies, and I know that there was an exhibit at the museum there in Santa Fe of flags that prisoners had made while they were imprisoned or had kept while they were imprisoned at the Maibara camp. One of the prisoners or former prisoners had taken some of the parachute material and went to a seamstress in town and had her create 4 flags representing the nations of the prisoners that had been imprisoned at Maibara. Those were US, UK, Australians, and a couple of Dutch.
Yeah, no, we have an exhibit up right now, the Flags of Freedom, depicting a similar situation. And so following the ultimate surrender of the Japanese, your father was liberated and returned home. And so we're just going to kind of conclude um, with the fact that this was an incredible story. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us, and even coming down here in a couple of weeks to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and being present at the unveiling of the exhibit. dedicated to this story.
Well, thanks so much, Ryan. I'll echo my father's comment. I'll talk to anybody that will listen about the sacrifice of the defenders of the Philippines.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for your service and your father's service to our nation. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. And so, just kind of concluding uh, our episode here. For all those who have listened up to this point, thank you. And if you're interested in learning the full story um, of Wayne Wright's father and understanding the true sacrifice that he and his comrades made, Bataan Corridor is available for purchase on Amazon. Wayne, if there's any way people can get in contact with you via social media or anything like that, feel free to jump in and make your contributions there.
Or I have created a website that was intended to support the book, but I ended up dumping a lot of information on there that's in the book. It's the website is bataan-corregidor.com. You check that out. You'll see I think there's a link to Amazon, but if the book is available on Amazon.com, if for those that are interested.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Wayne, again, thank you so much for sharing your father's incredible story with us today. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And as we reflect on these powerful stories, remember the past shapes us, the present inspires us, and together they guide us to the future. We're grateful to have had you on this journey through history. Until next time, keep reflecting, keep learning, and keep growing. For more information, please visit our website at www.nmmilitarymuseum.org or stop by and see us in person at 1050 Old Pecos Trail, Santa Fe, New Mexico, 87505. Until next time, keep honoring our veterans and stay connected for more Echoes of Valor.